In my last strategy video, I talked about prioritizing scarce assets in Dynasty and this impatience that a lot of managers have when it comes to making trades. I'm going to link that video down below. It is a shorter one. I think it's worth watching before today's video. But I think that this is an under-discussed concept. Just trade strategy in general. All the content out there is like buy this player, sell this player. There's not a ton of focus on the best way to actually make those trades and which assets you should be prioritizing for the long-term success of your Dynasty team. Now, in that last video, I talked about rookies and first-round picks and elite young players as these scarce assets that you want to be prioritizing in trades whenever you can. Today, I want to build on that concept and kind of give you a logical framework for making Dynasty trades. Basically, I want to give you a place to start when you are sending or countering a trade offer. And to do that, what I have today is something that I'm calling the trade priority scale. And what you're looking at on this chart is not a reflection of Dynasty value. What this is a ranking of Dynasty asset classes, all the different types of assets that make up your Dynasty roster. And I have them ranked here in the order that I would want to be trading them away to get other things that I want, things that my team needs. So today I'm going to walk you through each of these asset classes and explain what they mean and why I'm prioritizing one over the other when it comes to the Dynasty trades that I'm making. But just as a quick caveat here before we get started, this chart assumes that whatever asset you're trading away, any of these things listed here that we're going to talk about, the assumption is that you are getting market value for whatever asset you're trading away. And by that, I mean you are getting a return for that asset that is in line with the consensus value set by Startup ADP or Fantasy Calc or Keep Trade Cut or whatever you want to look at that gives you a rough idea of what a player is worth in general in the Dynasty space. And obviously, in your actual league, that's not going to be the case for every single player on your roster. There are going to be players you have or even picks that your league mates don't value in line with the general consensus. But I have no way of accounting for micro market differences between your league and my league and someone else's league. So I'm making the assumption here that whatever assets you're trading away, you are getting a fair return for, and you can just mentally adjust to your league mates. Think about what they might be under or overvaluing, which of these asset classes that might apply to, and just handle that accordingly in your league. But I think the best way to understand this chart and what it actually is for is to just kind of jump right in and start unpacking these different asset classes. So we're going to start at the top here. And remember, the things that are listed at the top, these are the assets that I am most willing to trade away on my Dynasty team. And as we work our way to the bottom, those are going to be the assets I am least willing to trade away. And so the Dynasty asset that I'm most looking to trade away are my personal fades. And a personal fade, that is a player that I, or in your case, you, value less than the market. Naturally, if other people in your league like a player more than you do, you're going to want to take advantage of that. You should care what the market, or at least what your specific league mates think of your players, because you want to be using the resources available to you in the most efficient way possible. Like for me, James Cook would be an example of a personal fade. I don't really agree with the general market consensus on James Cook. If I could roster him at the cost of an early second, and nobody in my league was willing to give me more than that, then I would have some shares on my teams. But in my experience, there is always somebody that likes him more than I do. And so if a James Cook share magically appeared on one of my teams, or like I found it in between the couch cushions or whatever, I would just immediately put James Cook on the block, and I'd probably trade him away pretty quickly. Because again, he's a personal fade where I don't necessarily agree with the market sentiment on him. Now, if you're not sure what players you happen to be below the market on, you can go over to dynastydatalab.com, you can go to fantasycalc.com, and you can look for the players that you roster, look at the players that are ranked around those players, and you can see, do you prefer a lot of the other names there? If so, you might be looking at a player that is better off on someone else's team, and you can utilize that value more efficiently. And it's probably worth sending out some offers. So you can do it that way. If you want to know who I personally fade, you can certainly get access to my rankings. You can become a YouTube member. Check the link in the description for that. And you can see who I'm below market on. You can compare my rankings to other sources like Fantasy Calc, and that's another good way to find trade opportunities. But moving on from the personal fade category, we have bench players. Again, working our way down this list, this is the next set of assets that when I'm going to send a trade or I'm countering a trade, these are the pieces that I'm more inclined to include in my offer to send to somebody else. And by bench players, I mean players literally on my bench, because depth is overvalued in Dynasty perpetually. People talk and think and write and make videos about depth in Dynasty far too often. The way that people treat depth pieces in Dynasty, it's like when you go on vacation and you think you need to pack 5 pairs of underwear for a 3-day trip. People get so concerned about this, and they get so concerned about the depth on their Dynasty rosters, and most of the time they don't even need those players. Like, just an example, last year I had a team that went through the entire season with Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert as my only quarterbacks in Superflex. I didn't have a backup, and the only tight end on my roster that was like a startable tight end was Hunter Henry. And I literally just never, I sent out some trades. Nobody wanted to give me a third quarterback or a backup tight end for a price that I like. So I just didn't have one. And that team made the finals, and it was no big deal. I didn't need the depth. And so, yes, obviously sometimes your players get hurt and you have bye weeks and whatever. But depth players and spot starts, they're pretty easy to acquire in season, especially if you have some draft picks that you can play around with. And that's an asset class we'll get to later. But in season, you have that flexibility to make trades. Just like when you go on vacation, you can probably just go to the store and buy more underwear if a real problem arises. But I don't like to just hold on to all those depth players because they tend to be more fragile in value. They don't hold their value. They're not as easy to trade away to other people when you actually need to address a new need. And sometimes you think you have these reliable backups, and then the guy you were banking on, like, oh yeah, I'll start this player for my bye weeks, then that guy gets hurt, or that player just busts, and then all of a sudden you have to fill that need anyway. So I don't think you should be prioritizing the depth on your bench. I think it should be one of the first things you're willing to trade when you have the opportunity to go get something better. And that doesn't mean you just need to gut your entire roster so you don't have a single usable backup. I'm not saying it's ideal to just have Hunter Henry and no other tight ends. But what I'm saying is that bench players are really the most expendable thing on your roster because they're so easy to replace. And again, they're just not a very efficient store of value because they're somewhat fragile. So I would rather store that extra value I have in picks. I would rather consolidate lots of bench players into better, more useful players rather than holding on to an excess number of backup options. Next, we have this category that I've labeled young replaceables. And what this refers to are young skill players, wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, guys that are providing near replacement level production. And we need to do some defining here. So by young, I really just mean anybody that's pre-age apex. The age apex is like the peak production season for fantasy players. So for running backs, I believe it's like age 25. For wide receivers, it's around age 27. It's just sort of a loose term. We don't have to apply it that strictly here, but younger players that are not giving you high-end production. So replacement level in a redraft context typically refers to production that you can find on the waiver wire. So you can look at a player on your team and you can kind of calculate their production over replacement by comparing that to players that are on waivers. In Dynasty, it works a little bit differently because your rosters are deeper. There's not actually really good options on waivers in a lot of leagues. So when I'm using it kind of loosely to just refer to this like low-end production that can be easily acquired, right? Think about what you could trade a third or a fourth round pick for. That, in my opinion, is kind of where the replacement level is. So like wide receiver 3 production, low end RB2, RB3 type of production, anything less than like 13 PPR points per game, I would consider to be pretty close to the replacement level. So you could go over to like Underdog ADP, or you could go to your favorite source of redraft rankings and go look at the names that are listed after like wide receiver 36 or after like RB 24, right? Somewhere in that range, you're going to find players like Jaden Reed, Khalil Shakir, Darnell Mooney, Michael Pittman, Brian Robinson, Tyrone Tracy, Zach Charbonnet, Tyjae Spears, Tank Bigsby, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts. Those are tight ends. I didn't talk about tight ends, but really anything outside of like the top 5 or 6 is pretty close to replacement level for tight ends because the production just gets so flat. But the reason that this asset class is one that I don't prioritize is because, as we've already established, you're not getting that production. You're not getting that impactful production. Obviously, some players in this group are going to potentially break out. But for the most part, you're getting something that is easy to replace, but you're usually having to pay a little bit more because these players are younger. There's this idea that they're going to get significantly better. Now, I'm not saying you should view every replacement level player as the same value. There's obviously a wide range of values here depending on the exact age of the players, their team situations, their talent upside. Like Ricky Pearsall and Tank Bigsby would both fit into this asset class. I'm not saying that they're the same value, but we've already worked out that whatever you're trading away, you're getting market price for. So that's accounted for. But what I'm saying is that those types of players do make good trade options when you have the chance to add a player in a more impactful asset class. Now, you might take issue with this because I am lumping in a number of players that are touted as these kind of lower end, like sleeper picks, so the potential breakout type of guys. I understand that some of these players are going to break out to some degree. They're going to emerge and give us better production than we've previously seen. I have a lot of Josh Downs, and I'll be the first to tell you he belongs in this group right now. He is a young player who is unlikely to give us production well above replacement this year. So I'm not saying you need to avoid all of these players or have zero exposure to them, but what I do think is they're actually pretty expendable in the pursuit of more impactful assets. And when we get into some of these other asset classes later on, you'll see that there are still plenty of ways that you can have access to value upside and keep your team young without necessarily chasing a lot of these types of players. Now, the next asset class is late round rookie picks, third rounders and fourth rounders. And you probably think I'm insane for putting this asset class ahead in the priority list of the younger players we just talked about. But remember, this isn't about value. I'm not saying I want to have a third round pick over Jaden Reed in a straight swap situation. We're saying this is at market. And I'm not really that tempted by most of the assets that I can acquire for a 2026 third or a 2026 fourth round pick, at least not yet. What I like is having a lot of these late round picks in season. In many cases, you can use these picks to acquire those bench players or even some of those young players that we've talked about in season. And so I'm prioritizing the liquidity of those picks. Like 2 years ago, 2023 season, Joe Flacco ended up becoming a really helpful waiver wire add in Dynasty. And if you had an extra third round pick, it was a lot easier to go and trade for him to fill a hole at quarterback than to try to move somebody like a Josh Palmer. The guy who picked up Joe Flacco, that they found a nickel on the street, they're not really looking to flip that for some young-ish replacement level player giving you 8 or 9 or 10 points per game. They just probably want to cash out for a pick. And so having an extra third in your back pocket was really helpful. And then lo and behold, Joe Flacco scores as like a, top 10 quarterback over those playoff weeks. That's harder to get done when you don't have picks. So I do actually prioritize my late rounders a little bit more than you might intuitively think. And when I'm not trading those picks away, I also like to draft rookies in the late rounds. There's a lot of upside there. You think of players like Harold Fannin and Jalen Milroe, Terrence Ferguson, Jarquez Hunter, DJ Giddens, even Jalen Knoll. These are rookies that have been going consistently in the third round this rookie draft season. And obviously, I'm not saying all those players are going to work out, but that gives you a lot of value upside on your bench. You can keep your team fairly young without having to prioritize a lot of these non-rookie players that cost more to invest in. And so these late round picks, I think they do serve a dual purpose that gives them a little bit of value. Next, we get to an asset class that I've labeled as expensive pre-breakout. This might be the most complicated asset class on the list to really wrap your head around. It's also probably the smallest group of players. There's really only going to be maybe a half dozen players that fit into this group in any given season. But these are non-rookies whose value prices in a significant step forward in production. These are like your most trendy breakout picks. They're kind of hype merchants, if you will. They get talked about ad nauseum on Twitter, on YouTube, either people downplaying their potential or really, really overselling it. Marvin Harrison right now, I think, is the quintessential example of this. You look at a player, Marvin Harrison, who obviously had a great prospect profile. He's going into year 2 coming off of an 11 points per game rookie season, and he's a very expensive dynasty asset. And I understand why, because people can still see that upside there as a guy that can take a step in year 2. I would also include Rome Odunze in this group. I think Caleb Williams should potentially be in this group, even Xavier Worthy. To some extent, this might even apply to JSN or Garrett Wilson. Obviously, we have good reason to believe that those are very good players, but they haven't actually given us the production to fully back up their dynasty costs. In other words, at their current dynasty cost, there is some expectation that they will score more points in the future than they have previously. And I'm not even saying that that's wrong. And you might balk at the idea of trading these players, especially prioritizing trading them over some of the assets we haven't touched on. And don't get me wrong, I know that there is upside here with these players, these expensive, non-rookie, pre-breakout players. Some of these guys could smash for fantasy, but this archetype is also one that tends to have more downside than a rookie. Where rookies are more insulated, these players, because they're not rookies, they actually have a lot of pressure to perform, or at least to give you enough hope, like a Garrett Wilson, where he just keeps racking up targets, so many targets that people can't fully give up on him as an asset. There is more downside there, and you're paying a lot to get these players relative to the points that they put in your lineup. So sometimes you're going to win with these players, for sure. JSN, I think, was an example of a player that you did win with, despite the fact that I wasn't super into him at his cost. Now, even that bet was quite a bit cheaper than what you have to pay to invest in like a Marvin Harrison or a Rome Odunze. But I think my real point here is less about those players being bad or being surely to bust, more so that there are more efficient ways, I think, that you can store that value. If you trade away right now Rome Odunze for Devontae Adams and a first, which is certainly a deal that you can get done in plenty of leagues out there, you're going to score more points this year with Adams in your lineup, and you get this locked-in value, accrual, and safety of a future first-round pick. It's hard to lose a trade like that, like especially in a significant way. The only way you could lose that trade really is if Odunze was to break out this year to such a degree that he is worth significantly more than the first. And even then, you probably still need Adams to bust to really feel bad about having made that move. So I just think that there are more efficient ways to store that value. And so it's not to say that I could never, ever roster those guys. It's just I'm willing to use them as a stepping stone to get into players that I either think have more immediate upside or more proven talent, or maybe a safer store of value like first-round rookie picks. All right, the next asset is second-round picks. This one's pretty simple. We don't have to spend a long time on it. This is similar to the late-round pick case, but you obviously have a more valuable asset here in a second-rounder, a more scarce asset than a third or fourth-round rookie pick, because there are only 12 in every given year. And you can find exciting profiles in the second round. There's a decent bit of value upside with second round picks that end up being early, especially depending on the rookie class. Sometimes there's a few elite assets that can trickle in to that early second round. So I want to be careful about trading my second round picks. They're also one of the more liquid assets that are available to you in Dynasty. It's very easy to get trades done involving seconds because they just sort of sit in a value range that is really close to a large cluster of useful players, where you can add a little bit to get a player. You can get a player plus a third round pick. There's so much you can do with second round picks that I do like to be careful about trading them. So I think they belong here somewhere in the middle of the chart, where I am pretty cautious about it, but obviously I'm willing to move them for a lot of other things that are more useful or more immediately exciting to me. And then we step into the back half of the chart. So at this point, we're getting progressively more scarce and less likely to trade these players away at their market value. And here at 7, we have veteran starters. So this category encompasses any non-rookie players that are fantasy starters, but not providing elite level production. And this is probably the biggest asset class overall. You have players ranging from Devonta Smith to Josh Jacobs to TJ Hawkinson, Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore. Pretty much every Dynasty team is going to rely on at least a few players in this group to provide some steady weekly production, especially if you're in like a start 10 league, a start 11 league. Now, there are some players in this group that are going to surprise us and provide elite production over maybe a small sample, or maybe a 1-year sample, like we got that wide receiver 1 season from DJ Moore a couple years ago. But in general, these are guys that are going to land outside of the top 12 at their position. A tight end going to land maybe outside the top 5 or 6. And there are some players that I like more or less in this group. Certainly, some of them are going to fall into the personal fades bucket, like a Terry McLaurin. But on the whole, these guys are fairly useful. They're not totally expendable. They're also not terribly scarce, and that's why they land kind of towards the middle here. But looking ahead at the rest of the list, if I can get rookies that I like, if I can get future first, if I can get actual elite production at a fair price in exchange for these players, that's something I'm quite interested in doing. So when I have a bit of surplus value, I often find myself taking these types of assets and then adding to them to get into these other asset classes we're going to talk about in a second. And just to be clear before we move on, if any of these players, these veteran starters, are sitting on your bench right now, like they're not in your lineup, they're going to funnel into that category. If you have an extra Joe Mixon lying around and he's not actually a starter for you, that is now a bench player, and that player is now more expendable because you do not want to have a surplus of these assets. The ones that are putting points directly into your lineup are fine. They're worth keeping because they're going to help you out a lot. But if you have a ton of these guys, you're going to want to reallocate that value into rookie picks, or you want to consolidate that value into elite production as much as you reasonably can. And then we get to rookies. And I talked about rookies as scarce assets in my previous video. I think a lot of managers struggle to hold on to rookies for a few reasons. One is that they see them as risky, which I've talked about in a lot of videos. I think is a very common misconception. They're actually one of the least risky assets that you can hold. But the other issue is that dynasty managers don't really look at rookies as players that are ever going to provide startable production, at least not during their rookie seasons. And again, kind of a misconception. A lot of the biggest hits that we see every year, especially over the back half of the year, are rookies. Think about what Bucky Irving was putting into your lineup. Think about Puka Nacua, or more high-profile rookies, guys like Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey. Like, we see rookies every year that come on in a big way, especially when we get to the fantasy playoffs. And then I think the other thing that can hamstring certain managers is that they are clinging to a bunch of these good but not elite young players that soak up a lot of roster value. I'm personally going to be prioritizing rookies over any young player that has not already proven to be elite. That includes guys like Marvin Harrison, guys like Rome Odunze. Again, at market value, like I can look at Marvin Harrison and say he carries a lot of value. I'm not just going to trade him away for any rookies because I like that asset class better. But if I'm getting fair market value, I would rather reinvest in rookies. And I actually thought about splitting this category into two groups for the more expensive, more projectable upside rookies versus like your speculative dart throws. I just couldn't think of a logical cutoff between the two, like an exact point that you can point to and say, this is where we split into two groups. But I just want to explain, like it's reasonable to treat players like Brashard Smith or Alec Aomanor more like the late round picks that we talked about earlier in terms of priority. You don't have to prioritize those guys quite as heavily. But the scarce rookies, those high-end guys that have great profiles, Emeka Egbuka, Amarian Hampton, Colston Loveland, those guys I really want to be cautious about. And I do not want to consistently be trading away all of my rookies and all of my picks as a means of chasing production. I find it's much, much harder to maintain a high-value roster year over year. So they do deserve to be prioritized. Next, we're going to get into the first category that deals with first-round picks. This is your current year first. And you could really place this side by side with the next category, the elite veteran category, because I think your preference here should depend on your team trajectory. But all teams, regardless of your outlook, should be protective of their first rounder. Even on a strong roster that I expect to make the playoffs with relative ease, I am not rushing out to trade my first round pick because that's a one-time opportunity that you have to trade that pick. I want to be sure that I'm getting the absolute best possible return. And it's extremely rare that I'm going to be trading away a first without getting an asset in one of these last three remaining categories: an elite veteran, a future year first round pick, or a young elite player. If I'm not getting one of those assets, it's unlikely that I'm actually going to go ahead and move my first. Now, naturally, I am more open to trading that first away on good teams, and I'm much more cautious with fragile or bad teams. But in general, I think being patient, being picky with your first is a universally good idea. And if you have multiple firsts, maybe you're coming out of a rebuild, consider the strength of each team that first belongs to, and then you can decide, yourself how to prioritize those picks, what you should be looking for in return for those picks. Now, getting into the home stretch here, let's talk about elite veterans, specifically at wide receiver, running back, and tight end. I'm using a slightly different definition of veteran here than I did the last time, so I apologize about that. But I'm splitting the elite producers into two groups: the elite veterans and then the young elite players. And really, this is just pre and post age apex. Okay, I'm doing this because once you get into this higher level of scoring, you start to see a much more drastic difference in dynasty value between the younger and the older players. And so here we're talking about post age apex. If you're 27 or older at wide receiver, 25 or older, or sorry, I should say 26 or older at running back, 28 or older at tight end, you are post-age apex. And as far as elite, that's maybe a little bit subjective, but try to think of players that are projected for or have a good chance to finish within the top 12 at running back or tight end, players that could finish as top 5 tight ends. This is like A.J. Brown, Christian McCaffrey, Devontae Adams, George Kittle, Jonathan Taylor begrudgingly makes this list. The points that these guys provide to you are difficult to replace. So again, we're thinking in terms of scarcity. You want players that score lots of points. There is a finite supply of players that do that. And so you want to be more cautious about trading them away. And you're often getting these points that these elite veterans provide at the most efficient price because they're not being propped up by youth. You're not paying this extra tax for, yes, this player scores points and they're also young. So you're getting the most bang for your buck here. And naturally with that, it comes a little bit more risk of these players losing value, especially quickly due to injury, but also gradually through decline. In my opinion, that is a totally fair trade-off for the reduced price that you usually have to pay for these elite veterans. Now, sometimes you're actually not getting a discount. Sometimes the market is going to value an elite veteran higher than I personally think is reasonable. Like Derrick Henry, for example. To me, he's not in this group anymore because I think that he's a bit overvalued for what he projects to give you at his age. So for me, he's actually a personal fade. He moves from this category 10 to category number 10 all the way back to category 1. He's not a guy that I roster very often because, again, there is almost always somebody willing to pay more than I think that he's worth. Then we get into future year first. So in other words, whatever this year is, not that one, but the next one, 2027 is the next future year first available to you in your Dynasty League. I hate trading these picks away because future year firsts, first of all, they have a ton of variance relative to your current year first because you just don't know what your team's going to look like a year from now. You might be super confident in that team and it could look so different. A lot of your players could take a totally new trajectory. You could suffer injuries, whatever it might be. And then that's compounded by the fact that you tend to get less in return on the market when you go to trade your future firsts. Now, there's so much hype right now around the 2027 class. You might actually be getting more for those picks than you would be for a 2026 first, but you're still going to get less right now than you would get if you waited until next offseason. So you're subjecting yourself to this extra risk where your pick could end up earlier than you hope. You have to trade it away at pretty much its lowest possible value right now. It robs you then of the flexibility when you get to that season. If your team looks like it needs to rebuild and you've already traded away your first round pick, now you're losing a massive benefit of that rebuild. And so that exposes you to a lot of downside risk where you could spiral into an unintentional rebuild that then drags on for an extra year because you don't get that 101 value boost. There's just a lot of things that can go wrong when you trade a future year first, and there's not that much that can really go right. So I am not trading away one of my future year first, 2027, 2028, unless it is in a deal that brings me a young elite player. That's our last category here. A young elite player, that means they're still before or at least within their prime years. They have not reached the age apex yet. Now, there is a wide range of value within this group, all the way from like Ladd McConkey, who's personally my lowest ranked player that I would consider in this group, to a Trey McBride, to a Malik Neighbors, to all the way up to Jaden Daniels. These are the guys that you really want to be pursuing in Dynasty because they are the best of both worlds. You get the elite production that can win you leagues, and you get this value insulation because these guys still have multiple peak seasons left. Their talent is established and it's well known. These are the most scarce, most high demand players that everybody wants, and you should always be chasing. You should always be taking opportunities to trade for these young elite players. So that's the trade priority scale. When I'm looking to make a trade, this is how I'm thinking about it. What assets do I most want to be trading away? What assets am I trying to get? And which ones am I protecting on my own roster? And I know I haven't talked a lot about quarterbacks today. They are kind of a unique asset in Superflex because they're difficult to trade without getting one in return. They almost have their own market. And so they sort of follow different rules. because there's this extreme scarcity of starting quarterbacks. And then unlike other positions, it's very binary where like a quarterback's either a starter or they're not. And if they're a starter, they're probably giving you a threshold of production that you can use. And if they're not starting, you get nothing from them. And so they're just a very different asset to work with. I couldn't think of any clean way to fit them into the existing categories or even give them their own category. So I just decided not to. Hopefully this is still helpful. You can still apply some of these ideas to the quarterback, how you value different types of quarterbacks, the riskier ones, the young elite ones, and all that kind of thing. But just to close this video out, I want to revisit this concept later, but I want to give you 4 rapid fire takeaways before we get out of here. No explanations. I'm just going to hit you with these 4 takeaways to think about, kind of sum up what we've talked about today, and I'll leave you with that. So number 1, you generally do not want to be trading into a lower asset class for even fair value. At least not at the high end, not with your firsts, not with your young elite players. You don't want to be downgrading asset classes in what you would consider a fair trade. Number 2, this is a pretty obvious one. Anytime you can trade within the same asset class and secure a value win, that's a good trade. Number 3, if you can trade up an asset class at what you would consider fair value, that is a good trade. You're getting the more scarce asset and you're not paying a premium to do it. Number 4, if you can manage to trade up an asset class and secure a value win at the same time, that right there, that's your best case scenario. That's pretty much what you're chasing in Dynasty trades all the time. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my Dynasty content, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It really goes a long way. And if you'd like even more Dynasty content from me, you can go down in the description, find the link to become a YouTube member today. That can get you access to private Discord channels where you can talk Dynasty with me anytime, my top 200 Dynasty rankings updated bi-weekly, weekly live streams here on YouTube, as well as discounts on Dynasty team breakdowns pretty much anytime. Either way, I'll be back soon with another Dynasty video, and I hope I'll see you then.